I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but there's obviously a positive impact on, kids with epilepsy. There are lots and lots of patient testimonies that speak to the benefits of cannabis. And this is the argument that I've been making with the regulators, that if we can do studies over not 100 people, but 100,000 people, and we can show that there's some benefit from these drugs, then we can start to build the evidence base in a very different way.
Gavin! How you doing, man?
I'm good, dude. Yeah, I'm good.
How's your weekend been?
Hectic. Yeah, busy.
What happened?
Where to start? I saw you on Saturday morning, didn't I?
Yeah. Did I tell you this?
I know what happened.
What? When we not about the cancellation.
Oh.
So, because we had a football match in Walthamstow, and Gav was like, "Well, we've got our event on. It's like 8 minutes from it. When you come?" I was like, "Yeah, I'll definitely come along." And so we got near it, and I was like, "I'm pretty sure we're near." We turned into the road, and I was like, "Yeah, we're here. We are here." Yeah, man, I saw you. It was great.
Yeah. So look, I run, the UK's biggest, I guess, cannabis and natural medicines event. It's called Product Earth. We've run this event for the last 9 years, and it grew to about 5,000 people last year. And we, for the last 4 years, have held it in Warwickshire at the National Agricultural Exhibition Centre, which is an amazing venue, a huge estate where the National Farmers Union is based, and we'd have people from all around the country come to our show. This year, for the first time, we decided to move it to London. And we thought, the cannabis market is maturing around the world. For the first time, we've got the Germans with a legal market, and we thought we'd bring this experience to London to try and raise this as a topic of conversation, raise the profile of the business, share the event with local press. And Drumsheds were supportive partners, given the kind of programming they run at their venue. And we've planned this event for the last year. We kicked off, it was an amazing vibe on Saturday. You came down, you saw all sorts of businesses. There are sort of 3 elements to what we do. There's a trade show where businesses can exhibit their products and services. And we get businesses from across the whole spectrum of the cannabis and natural medicines industry. So everything from cannabis seeds and all of the paraphernalia and equipment required to grow cannabis, so lights, fertilizer, plants, nutrients, etc., all the way through to the end user or the patient who either goes to a clinic to access cannabis through a prescription. So we had a number of clinics there, or they are buying CBD products from Amazon or Holland & Barrett. So we had this range of businesses from around the cannabis space. The second element is an education seminar where we get speakers, academics, clinicians, patients, entrepreneurs, experts from around this industry to come and educate our audience on a particular topic. And then the third piece is entertainment. We have an amazing music lineup. And this year we had Kiss FM garage legend Scott Garcia come to program for us because he's got a range of rolling papers. And he's been with us in the past and wanted to bring green-friendly artists to our show. So that was the event that we put on. It kicked off at 11 when you showed up. I know you had to run off to your football match afterwards. And we had what we thought was a pretty successful day. There were some mishaps during the day, but we thought we could manage them. But from the perspective of the venue, of Drumsheds, the events of the day put their license at risk. And so we had a conversation after Saturday with the venue, which went on for a couple of hours, around their concerns. And they had concerns around the number of people smoking inside the venue. So smoking outside the venue, we can all understand, despite what Keir Starmer might want to do, is still legal. But inside the venue, you can't smoke in any venue in the UK. And that was a concern for them. So we tried to address their concerns on Saturday evening. They had a pretty strenuous security team, security searching policy in place. I talked about closing down bits of the experience, but to no avail. And so we published a statement on Saturday night to say that day 2, Sunday, was going to be cancelled. and we've been dealing with the aftermath ever since.
Yeah, I got that. I felt like I got it about 2 a.m. I was like, what? I think I was texting you at 2 a.m.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was like, I knew you would be up.
Yeah. So we had late night calls, and at 2, I think we published the message.
It was, just to explain what it was like, the entrance was like going to like a rave or a concert, because the venue it's like a rave venue. And so there was lots of security. You didn't get in quick. They were checking everyone. And then when you got inside, it felt like a small version of, do you remember Bitcoin Miami when they had the music day?
Yeah.
Felt like that. You had an expo hall, you had a food court, you had a music area, and you had conference facilities. Honestly, it just felt like the same venue, that rather than like Bitcoin nerds, you had greenheads. And but it was very cool. I tell you, a couple of the coolest things about it was somebody coming in who doesn't have much knowledge of the industry as an industry, is the amount of things I learned. So there's that lady from the hemp company.
Hempen, a cooperative, yeah.
So I learned all about the different products you can make with hemp, which was wild. There was like building materials. We'll get into that. And then there was a guy who was selling different products based on mushrooms, legal mushrooms as well.
Functional mushrooms.
Yeah, I bought 2. I bought one, which is one you can use instead of coffee, and a sleep one. Also, Stig of the Dump.
Yeah.
His girlfriend was there exhibiting as well, so
Very
I got
cool.
to meet her. So yeah, it was very cool. So I had a mushroom beer. Connor and his mate got some food. It was, to be honest, it was annoying to have to leave because I didn't have enough time there.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask how many people were smoking? Like, how big of a deal was it?
Look, from the perspective of the venue, it was a big deal. It's an event for cannabis enthusiasts, so there's a fair amount of cannabis consumption. I guess what I shared with the venue is that cannabis is legal on prescription in the UK, has been for 6 years. So you will have patients who are coming in with legally prescribed cannabis, and they have their rights as patients. You can't discriminate against them. And in some cases, those patients don't like to heat their cannabis, they like to combust it. So they will be seen smoking. But I think the real issue was smoking inside the venue.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the real issue for the license.
So what's the outcome been?
Of the event.
Yeah, what happened?
mean,
Obviously you're worried about everyone. What was the reaction been?
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, we had to get everyone out of the venue safely. So that happened yesterday. All the exhibitors packed down their stands. We put out a statement this morning saying that we're going to refund all the ticket holders from the Sunday. We'll talk to Eventbrite about giving the weekend passes half their money back. We'll figure out what we do with the exhibitors. So it's putting in process the sort of remedial steps that we need to take.
But how did people
cancellation
respond? Because like me as a ticket holder feels like, this is the industry that's been attacked. This is bullshit. I back you, support you.
I mean, there's an element of that. Look, it's not the first time events in this industry have been cancelled, right? So we're sort of used to it. And as an industry, in some ways, not persecuted is the wrong way, but you have to learn how to navigate, the legal environment, the regulations, law enforcement. That is something that we've had to do as an organisation. But for sure, you feel, there's no reason for this not to happen. You can throw mud at the venue. Okay, they could have known what they were getting into, but really, it just feels like these are such archaic laws, especially when you go around the world and see how other countries are dealing with this sort of thing. Cannabis tourism is real. People are traveling around the world to hotspots which are fostering these industries. We've talked about my history in the space, but I used to work in the US, and we'd see people move from state to state to go and experience these events, and so the UK is a laggard. The UK is a laggard, and I think it's now time for us to start to have much more serious conversations about what we're doing with drugs in general.
Well, fears of license holders are real.
Yeah,
I'm a
for
license
sure.
holder. I hold 2 licenses for my bar and my football club. And we've had a visit from the local council with regards to noise at the bar. And it feels a little bit like the Stasi are coming to see you. And you have all these reports that come in at decibel levels. There's been one complaint, by the way. And then we have to do all these new reports, buy all this equipment.
Yeah.
But if they take your license away, you can't operate.
Exactly.
Yet you've still got a lease to pay. So they hold a lot of control over you. Therefore, there's a lot of fear. So, I understand their fear.
It's a threat.
Yeah, it's a threat.
Broadwick, drum sheds, it's their whole business that's at risk. And so I can absolutely understand why they have to take a zero tolerance stance on drugs, which is what we have to do as a business.
Weirdly, I kind of feel like local councils will probably be the last people to get this, because I don't think there's any excuse for Parliament to not understand this, because I would assume if you could get the stats, it would be a very high double-digit percentage that smoked weed at some point, because they all probably went to uni.
Yeah, 100%.
Probably a high amount have done coke, but even in Parliament.
Yeah, exactly. You find the traces. Yeah,
but yeah, so it's we're in this weird place whereby you just look at, you can make this argument, let's just objectively compare the societal impact of alcohol and cannabis, and neither is zero. We can be realistic about that. But alcohol has a really detrimental impact on society, the NHS, violence, relationships, health.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist in any way near the same with the cannabis industry, yet alcohol is legal, cannabis isn't. I'm not saying we should make alcohol legal here. What I'm saying is the prohibition on cannabis makes no fucking sense anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth, exploring the roots of prohibition of not only cannabis, but all drugs. And I think it comes down to, politics, economics, and racism. But you're right. There have been rankings on the relative harms of all of the different drugs, and alcohol is orders of magnitude more harmful than cannabis. Cannabis is just a healthier class of psychoactive, and we can see it in the consumer data in those markets where both cannabis and alcohol are legal. There is a shift from alcohol consumption towards cannabis consumption, and it's most marked in younger populations. So yeah, for sure, the relative harms of cannabis and alcohol have been misstated, and it seems rational to have a conversation about legalization of cannabis, for sure.
Why does the wall exist, do you think, now, still?
Why does it exist now still?
Yeah, it seems to me after, I've been out to the US now probably 100 times, right?
Yeah.
You had a dispensary there. I remember when Colorado first introduced it, but friends of mine had a dispensary there. I went to see it, and it was incredible. It was like going into an Apple store.
Yeah.
And I've seen it expand in California and various states, and the world has not fallen apart.
Yeah, exactly.
And the income from taxation, it's high.
Yeah. What can you say? Stigma takes a long time to shift.
Okay.
And we've been fed this sort of drug war propaganda for decades now. I guess I'm of the generation that sort of remembers Just Say No and Nancy Reagan and all that kind of stuff, right?
Zammo.
Yeah.
You remember Zammo? You won't know Zammo.
No.
Yeah.
So there's this TV program called Grange Hill.
I remember Grange. Well,
Okay.
I know Grange Hill.
So Grange Hill, obviously, it's, for anyone in the US listening, it's like this historical kids TV show about a school and a bunch of kids at a school. And there was this kid called Zammo, and he was the guy who, the character, the storyline where he got into drugs, and he dies, doesn't he? And he gets found by, what's his name? Who was the guy who found him? The old angry guy. Anyway, and he dies, and it's really sad. I don't know what drugs. It probably was marijuana. He probably smoked a spliff and died. But after that, we had the whole song, didn't we? The Top of the Pop song.
Yeah.
Just Say No. They just sung this song.
I've heard that song on yes.
So it all came from that. So all drugs. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there was no difference between heroin and marijuana to me.
It was all demonized, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was all just forbidden and wrong.
I mean, the funny thing is about that, I've just pulled up the harm to users chart for all different drugs. The only three that are above alcohol are crack, meth, and heroin.
Yeah.
And that's how serious alcohol is, and cannabis 17th or something.
So hold on, what comes after alcohol?
Cocaine.
Cocaine's less harmful than...
According to this chart,
How are they measuring it?
Higher harm to users, less harm to others with cocaine, but...
Higher harm to... Yeah, okay. Yeah, because your heart might blow up, but you're not going to go kick someone's head in.
Well, you might, but
Less
so.
likely. More likely with a Stella.
Yeah.
What about... just read down till you get...
So it's crack, meth, heroin, alcohol, cocaine, GHB, amphetamine. I don't even know what the next one is. Cathinones.
No.
synthetic cannabis, propofol, ecstasy, natural hallucinogens, ketamine, barbiturates, benzos, and then cannabis.
Yeah, you know this synthetic cannabis. Is that something you distance yourself from? 'Cause
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that like spice?
Yeah, exactly.
and is the branding completely off as synthetic cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, synthetic cannabis is a sort of outcome of prohibition, right? Cannabis as a plant has what are called phytocannabinoids, so plant cannabinoids, so naturally derived compounds, which are very safe. Actually, there's no lethal dose of cannabis. It's very challenging to consume so much cannabis that you die. And so these plant-based cannabinoids, if they weren't prohibited, would actually do a job in society. They'd work. These synthetic cannabinoids fall outside of the prohibited framework. And so, smart scientists and drug dealers are trying to figure out ways in which they can find effectively loopholes. How can I find a cannabinoid that looks similar, but is not exactly the same as a plant cannabinoid that will also affect what's called the endocannabinoid system in the human body?
Oh, so this is this whack-a-mole thing whereby they're engineering something that's legal to sell.
Yeah, exactly. It's legal to sell, and this is why the legal highs, legislation came in, the Non-Psychoactive Act.
Yeah, I don't know if it's still
Substances Act.
around, but when I was sort of 18 to, I guess, like 21, there was a lot of those legal high shops where they'd sell things that was like legal MDMA or whatever, and they'd sell it as plant fertilizer or something like that, and you just go to a shop in a high street.
So this is all around how do you circumnavigate the rules that have been put in place to try and prevent harms, but nefarious actors are just going to say, well, I'll do it legally in another way, and I'll use smart chemists to figure out what that looks like. And so that's what happens with synthetic cannabinoids. You get this sort of explosion in the types of cannabinoids that people are willing to produce and then sell. And they're not safe because you can die from synthetic cannabinoids in a way that you can't from plant cannabinoids.
Because
they're not adapted over time to be safe for the human body. They have a different safety profile.
that's all these negative consequences of prohibition.
Yeah.
Can we do the history then?
Yeah.
Like the background of why and how it was demonized.
I mean, look, cannabis has been, so the first recorded use, I guess, is about 10,000 years ago as a food, so hemp in China. First recorded use as a medicine is about 2,800 BC. Again, in China, 5,000 years ago, it was smoked in India for spiritual use, spiritual reasons. So this is a long kind of history for millennia. I guess more recently, the Brits discovered cannabis being used in India in the 1800s during the British Empire. I mean, the British had used hemp extensively, so the industrial use of cannabis for all sorts of things in the empire. But the sort of medicinal use of cannabis was sort of rediscovered in the 1800s in India, where it was used with kids with epilepsy. And so sort of seizure reductions was noted. The medicine was brought back to the West. It was prescribed famously to Queen Victoria for menstrual cramps in the late 1800s. And it was widely used, administered as a medicine.
No considered negative consequences.
I mean, there are historical reports about, some of the mental health impacts.
Right, okay.
So that's been in the literature for a while. But, it was acknowledged as a medicine like any other that has a benefit risk profile. And it was assessed as such. There was no kind of stigma around it. It was just another medicine. Around the turn of the 1900s, things started to change, I guess, and the number of different factors, but I guess from an economic perspective, hemp has uses as a paper replacement, so it threatens folks who've got investment in wood and trees. It has uses as a plastic, so it threatens folks who've got investments in petrochemicals. It has potential uses as a fuel.
Hold on, have you seen the plastics with hemp?
I've seen little bits about it. I don't know very much.
So when I was there at the event, that the lady had the hemp stall, she showed me a Frisbee. And if you hadn't told me, I'd assumed it was plastic.
Yeah.
It feels like plastic. But if you throw this in the ocean, it's just going to biodegrade.
Yeah, Yeah, it will just degrade. It's organic material.
Yeah.
So it's just miles better.
Yeah. So for example, if you made plastic bottles, if you could engineer them at the same price, you could produce plastic bottles out of this. When people throw them away like idiots, they will just degrade.
Yeah.
And you went out with plastic in your balls.
Yeah. I mean,
Win-win.
it seems crazy that we sort of based our economy 100 years ago on oil when we should have based it on hemp. And as I say, it was, economic reasons, political reasons.
And is it mass producible at a good enough price point that would have been possible?
Yeah, it's called weed for a reason. It grows everywhere, extremely cheap to grow. It's a very hardy, resilient crop. It adapts to most climates. We've had strains of hemp in the UK adapted to Scotland. So hardy crop and very cheap to produce. Actually, if you think about where globally the most cannabis is likely to be produced, cannabis is a plant that requires 12 hours of light and 12 hours a day. So there's a sort of band around the equator where you can imagine there's plentiful sun, cheap land, water, that is where it's going to be grown. And if you look at what's happening in the US, it's in California. So California is going to produce all of the cannabis for the US. It's just in due course over time. Right now, we have this weird system where each state has its own market in the US, but federally, cannabis is still illegal. So you have the farmer in wherever, Vermont, producing the cannabis for Vermont, and the farmer in Texas producing the cannabis for Texas. But over time, comparative advantage will prevail, and it will go to where it's cheapest to produce.
And so so hemp was basically a risk to a number of industries.
Yeah, hemp was a threat to the paper industry with Randolph Hearst, the petrochemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, when you think about all of the different medicines that you can produce from the cannabis plant. So we basically, over time, regulated it away and demonized it. And it's taken, let's say 80 years, I guess I would say that the sort of, I describe them as the resistance in Star Wars, the sort of farmers in California who were sort of keeping the plant alive and, in the 60s and 70s against Nixon were, the resistance. And I think it really started to, people say that, when the AIDS epidemic kicked off in California in the late 70s, early 80s, gay men who are having chemotherapy would find relief from cannabis. It would, address their nausea and help them to eat, it would relieve their appetite suppression. So there's always been a tight link between the cannabis community and the gay community. And that's when it was sort of first acknowledged, I guess, as a medicine. And over time, over the next sort of, from the early 80s, 1996 was the first year that Canada, California, and Israel sort of introduced a medical regime. And since then, I have this line that I use: cannabis is on a journey from drug to medicine to lifestyle. And that journey from drug to medicine, I guess, is almost complete in the US, has been completed in Canada. We are on that journey from drug to medicine in most other parts of the world. So for sure in Europe, Asia, Africa. And then on the journey from medicine to lifestyle, the west coast of, North America, you can drive from Alaska down to Mexico and you are in adult use cannabis states, these are weed country. These are lifestyle products now, the medicinal use has been accepted and now people are saying there's a lifestyle and a culture around these products. And I think in Europe, Germany is the first place to do this. They've just moved from the sort of strict medicinal use to adults being able to grow plants at home and to be able to join social clubs.
It feels like there are these baby steps you have to go through.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
like the medicinal use is it's hard to argue against a child with epilepsy being told telling the parents they cannot have access to marijuana, which stops their fits. And I'm bringing that up because that was a specific case in the airport where the Home Secretary had to step in. Was it Jack Straw?
Sajid Javid, that's right, back in 2018.
Sajid Javid?
Yeah, so Jack Straw, that chart on relative harms of drugs was published under Jack Straw's tenure as Home Secretary by Professor David Nutt.
So I've got this wrong. Jack Straw was the one who was he campaigning against?
He was the Labour Home Secretary, I think. I can't remember who reclassified cannabis from C to B. I think it was
Yeah.
I think it was under Gordon Brown. Maybe it was Jack Straw.
I know for a reason. I thought it was Jack Straw on when it was Home Secretary, but not for the epilepsy case. But actually, now I'm starting to think about it.
So the epilepsy case was 2018, and it was
Yeah.
Sajid Javid. And I guess I actually went to Israel in 2016 and to sort of meet folks in the cannabis industry there. And that was the first time that I heard about like a developed program to look at research into kids with epilepsy using cannabis medicines. I guess the most famous example is a young girl called Charlotte Fiji from the US. She had epilepsy and found relief from this product produced by a company called Charlotte's Web. So Charlotte's Web is now one of the most prominent CBD brands. We've got Charlotte in the US. We've got some children in Israel who were using cannabis oils. They'd call them the lost children. So they were kids who had tried all the pharmaceutical meds. None of them had worked. And the sort of hospital system called them the lost children. And there were some academics at, Hebrew University and some of the cannabis growers who would say, look, we think our medicines might be impactful. Can we try them? And so research started there. And I guess I always say that the two most active patient communities are in epilepsy and autism. Parents are quite, they're very engaged. They want to find cures for their kids. And so word spreads in these communities, which typically assemble online, their Facebook groups or Discord channels or whatever. And so word spread to the UK. And so a couple of the parents ended up, sourcing these oils from wherever they were legal. They would smuggle them in from Holland or get them imported from Canada. And as you say, back in the summer of 2018, there were two young boys, one called Alfie Dingley and the other called Billy Caldwell, whose cases came to prominence in the press, and this sort of public clamour for access to these medicines for these young children became something that the government, had to address. And so it was a political act that legalised cannabis or rescheduled cannabis from Schedule 1 into Schedule 2.
What does that mean?
So Schedule 1 in the sort of classification of these substances means there's no acknowledged medicinal use and there's a high risk of abuse, right? So for all these years, Schedule 1 implies that there's no medicinal use for cannabis, and the knock-on impact is that it becomes really, really difficult to do any research. Because if you accept that there's no value, then the hoops you have to jump through to actually secure the product, to do the research become really, really challenging. So the move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 acknowledged that there is a medicinal use of cannabis, and we can all see it with our own eyes because young kids with epilepsy no longer have seizures. So they had to do something in 2018. Since then, not much has moved in the UK. It's been challenging.
How did that needle move forward, though? Because you say Sajid Javid stepped in. My memory is somebody at an airport.
Yeah,
exactly.
Airport. Yeah, it was an airport.
And the mum was quite hysterical.
Yeah, I think it was Billy's mother, Charlotte. The medicine was seized, I think, and then Billy started having seizures himself.
Yeah.
And he went to Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And I think the doctor said, look, we need this oil to relieve this patient.
But who takes it then? Who takes it forward to say, okay, this needs to go from Schedule 1 to...
Well, I think it was sort of rushed through, but I guess it's the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs and the Home Office and, various bodies in the government that have to agree these things. But there's a process. But I think it was rushed through for cannabis.
You were already on your program then, weren't you, back in 2008? You'd already moved into this industry.
Yeah. So I moved into this industry in 2015. I heard about what was happening in 2014 in the US, decided to go and explore, moved with my wife and two kids to Boulder, Colorado in the summer of 2015 to figure out what was happening. What are dispensaries? What are these products that they're selling? Who are the people buying them? How are they consuming them? What do they do? All these were open questions to me. And so I went and figured that bit out. And what did I see? I saw middle America, typically in their 40s, 50s, 60s, with daily ailments, back pain, joint pain, can't sleep, feeling low, going to get cannabis products from these dispensaries. And the culture was very different. It wasn't something that was hidden or stigmatized. People would talk about it openly. So I guess, I saw this and I thought this is the future. I came back to the UK, raised some money, moved to downtown Las Vegas with a business partner and acquired a distressed medical cannabis dispensary and built it out and started serving patients and started to understand why this was an interesting industry. Vegas in particular is interesting. The Vegas proposition in the 20th century was essentially, big brand beer like Bud, Budweiser, pretty shitty nightclub entertainment experiences, crap food, and the Vegas business establishment and the mayor could see that this wasn't going to be fit for purpose for the 21st century. The next generation of tourists wants, Ibiza DJs and, Michelin-starred restaurants, and they're not drinking. They want a healthier class of psychoactive. And so in 2016, November 2016, alongside the US presidential election of Trump with Hillary Clinton, there were 5 ballot initiatives in the US to move from medical use of marijuana to adult use. And California voted then, Arizona, Nevada, Massachusetts, and I think there was one other, maybe New York, I can't remember. California passed and Nevada passed. So all of a sudden, I had a dispensary, one of the first 10 dispensaries in Vegas, with the ability to serve the 50 million people that come into Vegas, all looking for a good time. And I thought, okay, going to be rich. What I hadn't banked on was Trump being elected. We had all anticipated Hillary Clinton becoming president, and basically Hillary Clinton standing on this platform of federally legal cannabis. And federally legal cannabis means the banks can accept your money, you can advertise on Facebook, Google, it becomes a legitimate business. When Trump got in, the first thing he did was appointed a guy called Jeff Sessions as his attorney general. And Jeff Sessions was a Republican from Arkansas, I think, really regressive on marijuana, hated it. And the first thing he said was he revoked what's called the Cole Memo. So under Obama, there's a chap called Justice Cole in the US who had produced the Cole Memo, which said, we will not use federal resources to prosecute state legal activities. So if you're running a state legal cannabis dispensary, we won't send in the FBI or to seize your cash. And the first thing that Jeff Sessions did when he was appointed Attorney General by Trump was to revoke the Cole Memo. And so the whole industry took fright. Investors were scared, about losing their money. And there was a couple of stories of Canadians who were stopped at the border to drive into the US and were prevented from coming in because they worked in the cannabis industry, and they were barred from ever coming into the US again. And I thought, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to, be barred from the US. So I ended up selling up in Vegas, coming back to Europe. And I guess, back then I was one of the few Europeans who had any experience of, the cannabis industry. So I started talking to governments, we were on this journey from drug to medicine in Europe, and there were a couple of countries that were pretty progressive on this. Malta, Portugal, Greece, Germany at the time. So I went around to see all these governments to explain, this is happening. Like, how do we bring this medical market to Europe?
There's a lot of alignment between what this industry's gone through and the industry that we've been in for the last 7 years.
100%.
I mean, the people I know at the dispensary in Colorado, they said they had real difficulty accessing banking services. I'm not sure if they couldn't get a bank, but what I do know is that it was a mainly cash business.
Yeah, exactly.
And because it was a cash business, they used to have the security companies come every day, collect the cash, take it away.
Yeah.
But they said it's like during the day you would have an increase in amount of cash on the business, and that presents risk because if somebody wants to come. People knew these businesses were
cash rich.
And so it's like another negative consequence of prohibition. Yeah. Like a federal prohibition introduced robbery risk at these dispensaries.
Yeah, absolutely. My business partner was held up at gunpoint in his dispensary in LA in the early days. Yeah, absolutely. So it's like in fact, hilariously, he asked me whether I wanted a gun when we opened up the Vegas dispensary. And I was like, I've never held a gun. And, no, not for me.
Did you like living in Vegas?
I did actually. I became quite fond of downtown Vegas. Yeah. So we went on the strip, but downtown Vegas I thought was quite cool. artsy area. There's a lot of like interesting people there. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Vegas.
Okay, so you're coming back to Europe, and you said you've talking to governments. Were you trying to work across Europe?
Yeah, so I set up a business back in 2017 called, or co-founded a business called Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies, which was really looking at the very traditional process of developing drugs from the cannabis plant. And we had some academics at Oxford, looking at cannabis for pain and developing drugs to address the pain from, IBS, IBD, cluster headaches, so trigeminal neuralgia. So there's some real promise in cannabis as a medicine, a prescribed medicine for patients with really severe conditions. So set up that business at Oxford. But what I was doing when I was talking to governments was talking about growing cannabis plants in greenhouses and making oils and, getting them administered without going through the very traditional clinical trial process, which can take 10, 15 years and cost hundreds of millions of pounds. My argument was always, we have some data. We have, data from the last 5,000 years about the safety profile of cannabis. And there's obviously a positive impact on, kids with epilepsy. There are lots and lots of patient testimonies that speak to the benefits of cannabis. So is there a different way of assessing whether we can bring this medicine to market? And that really has been what I've been focused on for the last sort of 4 or 5 years.
With the plant, help me understand the plant itself, because you have CBD products, which I'll see now. I can go into Boots Chemist and you'll see CBD products, and
exactly.
Obviously you have the THC component and then hemp itself.
Yeah.
Help me understand the
plant itself.
The plant itself,
yeah,
because
okay.
does it have to get engineered in certain ways to get around certain legislation at the moment?
Yeah. Typically it does. So we divide the world basically into the world of hemp and into the world of cannabis. Hemp is typically used for industrial purposes. So that's the world of these plastics and energies and textiles and all that kind of good stuff. The hemp plant is typically considered to have less than 0.2% THC, or 0.2 or 0.3% THC, depending on where you are in the world. So it's considered a non-psychoactive plant. It's not going to get you high. So it's just for industrial purposes. So it seems crazy that there are any restrictions around the growing of hemp, right? You can't get high smoking hemp, but this has a transformative potential for multiple industries and the environment. So hemp is sort of in a category of its own. Then you have the cannabis plant. And there are 4 frameworks for the cannabis plant, the 4 frameworks that I use to describe the cannabis plant. The first is the pharmaceutical framework. Right? That is the world of doing these very, very long-winded, expensive clinical trials, but you get to you produce the highest burden of proof for a doctor that a particular drug works. So if you go through this process of doing the randomized controlled trial and the result is positive, the medical establishment can't quibble. They can't argue with you. And there's one company that's done this in the cannabis space. They're called GW Pharmaceuticals. They're a British company. And they went through this process over the last 20 years to produce a medicine for kids with epilepsy. And it's now prescribed. So that's the first framework, pharmaceutical. The second framework is what we call the unlicensed medicine framework, which is what you see in the UK today. It's what you saw on Saturday at the event that we held at Drumsheds. And it's this sort of burgeoning industry in the UK and in places like Germany and Australia and Canada, where doctors are prescribing cannabis medicines that have not been through this process of 10 years of clinical trials and investing hundreds of millions of dollars. But there's some early evidence that it works. And with that early evidence, we sort of have a nascent market, maybe 50,000 patients in the UK who are getting this medicine through private clinics as an unlicensed medicine. So not funded by the NHS, you get it privately, and there's no real proof in terms of how a doctor would see it, but there's proof enough for the patients who are getting benefit from it. So that's the second framework, the unlicensed medicine framework. The third is what you're talking about, CBD products available from Amazon or Holland & Barrett or Boots or Superdrug, your local pharmacy. And those products, again, don't contain THC or trace levels of THC, and so they're not psychoactive or they're not going to get you high. CBD is considered an anti-anxiolytic, so it reduces your anxiety levels, so it does have an impact on the brain, but it's not going to make you high. So that's the third framework, right? And the final framework is the vice framework. right?
The fun bit.
Yeah, that's the fun bit, right? That is alcohol, tobacco, cannabis regulated as a vice product.
Yeah.
And that world only really exists in the US at the moment,
Okay.
right?
So how?
And so those are the frameworks,
Yeah.
right? Now, within the plant, just to talk about the chemistry very quickly, there are 3 primary sets of compounds, chemical compounds, that make up the cannabis plant: cannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids. So cannabinoids are what you've heard of: THC, CBD, CBN. And cannabinoids are like terpenes. They're sort of signaling molecules in nature. And they mediate responses in the body, these cannabinoids. So THC is the cannabinoid that makes you high. Everyone knows it for its euphoric effects. CBD has multiple uses. We think there are maybe 65 pathways in the body through which CBD can act. But we can see it having impacts on pain and mood and et cetera. And there are about 130 to 150, no one quite knows, cannabinoids. And we have a fairly good understanding of THC and CBD, and we have not much of an understanding about the rest of them. And we're starting to understand that CBN could be useful for sleep, or THCV could actually be very useful for metabolic conditions, so for weight loss, for example. And so that's a treasure trove of molecules that we have to go and explore and understand. The second group, terpenes. Terpenes are molecules which give substances their smell. So that kind of characteristic smell of cannabis, that's coming from the terpenes. And there are, again, hundreds of terpenes in the cannabis plant. And we're just starting to understand what terpenes do. And again, they're sort of medicinal compounds. They have a therapeutic effect on the body. An example of a terpene might be something like linalool, which is found in the lavender plant. So if you think about lavender, if you were to, smell a lavender plant, what do you feel? You feel quite calm, right? So you get these effects from these terpenes in the cannabis plant. And then the final group are the flavonoids, and they give the color. So when you're looking at the plant, you'll see the different colors of the leaves and the buds. And they also have a therapeutic effect. So those are the kind of 3 broad categories of chemicals in the plants in the plant, and we've only really understood THC and CBD. If I'm honest, there's a lot more to do.
And with so obviously they can produce the plant with low low THC.
Yeah.
But are there medicinal purposes to the THC as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the most widespread use of THC is for chronic pain. If you look at the data, people find value from THC for pain. So I've worked with people who've had, fibromyalgia, arthritis, back pain, joint pain, knee pain.
Is that because what it's doing to your brain, the calming is doing to the other parts of your body?
Yeah, exactly. So we should probably explain. Yeah, no, it's a good point, Steve. So why does this stuff work in the human body? So you're familiar with things like the, your pulmonary system or your cardio system. There is a system in the body called the endocannabinoid system. So it's a system of receptors through the body that respond to cannabinoids, right? And there are 3 types of cannabinoids. We've talked about 2 of them: synthetic cannabinoids, which are sort of man-made in a lab; phytocannabinoids, which are produced by the cannabis plant, and other plants actually produce these cannabinoids naturally. And then the third type are endocannabinoids. And we all produce endocannabinoids naturally. So these signaling molecules are something that we produce from our diet based on what we eat. This endocannabinoid system that we have responds to these endocannabinoids that we produce. So it's an interesting system. The 2 primary receptors are called CB1 and CB2. The CB1 receptor is found in the brain. There are 10 times as many CB1 receptors in the brain as there are any other type of receptor. And that basically explains why THC works. It hits this CB1 receptor in the brain and gives you this feeling of euphoria.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. It's a tough pill, knowing the Earth is better without us. But imagine if instead, we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
It's funny. Again, I think to the Bitcoin industry. Actually, I got into Bitcoin because of my mum.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, my mum. We wanted to get her. She was 3 weeks away from death from cancer, and we just wanted to get some cannabis oil to treat her. And obviously, you can't buy it. You can't buy it for two reasons. One, it's illegal, but two, there's no real industry for it. Well, it's one of the things I noticed when I went to my first dispensary. Suddenly, because it's legal, there's a reason to produce all different strains, delivery mechanisms.
It's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, we'll talk about it in a second. Go on.
When I was buying weed at school, uni, your choice was pretty much resin or weed or skunk, but really it's whatever they had at that time. I think, and once I got pollen, which was interesting. But whatever the dealer had, and you'd always hope they'd have skunk. And it was very rare back then, but that was it. But because the industry has proliferated, I remember going to the dispensary and there were drinks, there were gummies, there was every strain, pre-rolled spliffs, even better than the first time I went to Amsterdam. Because the first time I went to Amsterdam, it was just different strains and you could either buy the weed or the pre-rolled spliffs. But in the US, like I say, it was like going into an Apple store. And you got an iPad with a menu. You had consultants behind the desk. What do you want it for? Is it recreational? Is it for pain? It's pretty wild.
It's really sophisticated. So I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But I guess look, in a market of prohibition, your producer is only going to make the flower, because they can get such a huge margin. What happens in legal markets is the price of that flower starts to look more like a commodity, and commoditized markets, in commoditized markets, prices drop. So how do you add value to your product? It's by transforming that commodity into something that's value added and branded. So the line I use is, weed is like grapes, hash is like wine, right? That's the analogy here, right? You take your grapes and you put them through a process and you make something that's high margin and branded and desirable. So what we're seeing in this evolution of the product landscape is the creation of these extracted or derived products, second generation products. Drinks are super interesting. So I can talk about this. I did a little bit of work for Diageo 5-6 years ago about what impact this is going to have, cannabis on the drinks market. And what was super interesting was that alcohol has also been prohibited, right? Alcohol was also prohibited. And if you think about what happened when alcohol came out of prohibition, actually the first brands that were produced straight after prohibition had hygiene factors as their appeal. So literally, this is clean. This is not going to kill you, right? And Gordon's Gin is famous for this, right? So the first wave of branding was around hygiene and safety. Once we'd established hygiene and safety in the alcohol market, then the second wave of brands became all around how cool you are and how, sexy you are and how you can dance. And it sort of appealed to much more aspirational elements. And I think the same thing's going to happen in cannabis. As we legalize, I think the first wave of brands are going to be all around it's clean, it's organic, it's been produced in the right way, there aren't pesticides and heavy metals and, The second wave of brands are going to be around, well, it makes me feel a certain way, or this is part of my identity. And it's going to be much more around these products, extracted products, derived products. Drinks are super interesting because that's how we socialize. That is like a well understood model for socializing. And Diageo had these, they call them occasions, the occasions framework. When do you have a drink, And I think those drinks, cannabis could fit really well into those occasions. And we're starting to see it in the US. We're starting to see the low THC, drinks market start to nibble away at the beer market and actually take share from cannabis as well. And you've got these new consumers. You've got, soccer mums who would rather have, a gummy or a cannabis drink than a couple of glasses of wine because it's 0 calorie and there's no hangover and, they're not damaging their liver. So I think those derived products are actually how cannabis will be introduced to, the 80-90% of people who don't currently consume cannabis.
And so the stigma is almost entirely gone in those markets in a single generation. Because I've seen it when I go out to the US, almost everybody I know has gummies. Mm-hmm. And it's quite funny you say soccer mums or mums, whatever, because it's mainly the women I know out in the US who have their gummies. It's like quite insane. But you go to somewhere like, it's funny, you go to blue states and there's no stigma at all.
Yeah,
there's still a little stigma in red states.
Yeah.
But that's I think that's just a generational thing.
In the 1940s and 50s, if you knew about tobacco blends and where the crop was produced, you were seen as sophisticated. In the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, if you knew about wine vintages and terroir and, you're seen as sophisticated. I think if you roll this forward 10, 20 years, if you know about cannabis land races and strains and extraction methods, you'll be seen as sophisticated. I think the language will start to change. And I think the sort of cultural value that you attach to someone who understands this product will be huge.
Has there been significant brands established? Because again, going around your event, it feels like the brands there still feel a little bit like, when you go into a smoke shop and there's like a bunch of Rizzlers with different names on them. Yeah. Does it require almost like the full legalization because you get to the point where you can have advertising, you can have famous people marketing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, it's as much as anything, it's a human capital challenge. It's like, how do you get the world's greatest marketing minds to address this category and this sort of generational opportunity to take something that, has been prohibited and make it into, a desirable product? The one of the directors of the event, Product Earth, was quite senior in the media industry, and he likens this shift to be a little bit like pirate radio becoming mainstream. So
Kiss FM.
Yeah, right. I mean, you had these stations which were on the top of council blocks, which authorities were trying to shut down. But there was a passion behind the people doing the music, and there was a demand. People wanted to listen to this stuff, and at some point, it seemed crazy to stymie it. And so, you open up, a bandwidth and give these people the opportunity to broadcast, and then it becomes a legitimate industry. And now, could you ever imagine thinking that Kiss FM was illegal?
No, of course not. It's a major
crazy
brand.
Yeah, absolutely. So that process, that normalization, I think, is what cannabis is going to go through over the next, let's say, generation or two. And it's hard to imagine now, but I guess it was hard 10 years ago. I didn't tell my mum and dad for a couple of years that I was doing cannabis.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's their reaction?
Yeah.
Are they fairly conservative?
Yes, absolutely. There's no two ways about it,
How did you approach it? So it's like your coming out party.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it was. I was quite fortunate in that when I launched the Vegas venture, it was covered in the Times. So I basically gave my dad a copy of the Sunday Times and said, "Look, this is what I'm doing now." I think it was a bit of a shock to them. I don't think my mum was comfortable talking about it for a couple of years. But then it changes, right? Because you see the impact on kids with epilepsy, and you're doing clinical studies on, and her peers, her family members are finding relief, from arthritis and, sleep
What would she
issues.
say to friends and family? They're like, yeah, how's Gavin getting on? Oh, yeah, it's okay.
Resident drug dealer.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, when I decided to when I was thinking about getting into cannabis, I walked across Spain. I did the Camino because I wanted to think about, is this a commitment that I'm willing to make? And I thought, yeah, I thought about it at the time, and I thought it's a 2-decade commitment to see it through. And we're about 9 years in now. And I had to think about whether I would be willing to tell people that this is what I do, because it was stigmatized back in 2014, 2015. People thought I was crazy, to go from the world of like...
We know that. It's like, look, I'm single, right? I'm dating. When people are like, what do you do? And I say, I have a podcast. They say, what's it about? I don't say Bitcoin because they're like, oh, you're one of those dickheads. So I'm like, yeah, it's a podcast on economics.
Yeah, exactly.
Human rights. Because if you say it's Bitcoin, people, they don't understand it because they go to the first thing they think of. I don't know what it's like for you guys, but with Bitcoin, the first thing they think of is scams.
Yeah.
Idiots have made money. They don't understand. Like today, before we were with you, we were with Anna Chekovich. She works for Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, and she worked for Navalny himself when he was trying to get on the ballot against Putin. She works for the Human Rights Foundation. All her job is helping activists use Bitcoin to fight corruption and dictators where they don't have access to the banking system. And people don't see any of that.
No.
And so, you have this like mild embarrassment where you're like, I want to say, because I am proud of it, but at the same time, like, I know you're going to judge me.
No, look, I'm the same. I have this phrase, cannabis is life sciences in drag.
Right.
Right? So you see it and you laugh at it, but it's science, it's biotech, and over time, it is the science and the data. It requires both. It requires the sort of analytical, scientific approach, but it also requires the story and the media narrative to change. And I guess my research activity is focused on, producing this data, but events like Product Earth are around normalization.
Do you feel drained by it? Like 9 years is a long time. I'm sure if I said, are you as far forward as you hope to be, that's a no.
No, it's definitely not as far forward as I'd hope to be. Am I drained? Yeah, it's tiring work, but it's got a purpose.
Yeah, but what's like the hold up? What's the key milestone you can't get to with this?
Oh, there are lots of blockers. Yeah. Look, on the medical side, there is a sort of fundamental rethink in terms of, how do we do drug development? Like, how do we, bring these products to market? And
sorry, just on that, I hate interrupting, but on that conspiracy side that pharmaceuticals hate marijuana because they can't patent it and sell it like they can sell high value drugs, is that real?
There are definitely lobbying efforts. Against
big pharma lobbying against.
Yeah.
Fucking, they're such assholes, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, look.
Fuck these.
Let me give you my experience, right? And I'll just tell you how this is my story. I've been trying for 4 or 5 years now to set up studies for kids with epilepsy in the UK. There are companies who are willing to offer their medicine for free. Now, obviously, as I say, these medicines haven't been tested in randomized controlled trials, but we work with kids who have extremely rare conditions. There might only be a couple of them in the world. How can you run a trial where you have one kid who gets the medicine and one kid who doesn't get the medicine? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. We need a different way of assessing how these medicines work. So I've been trying to push these alternative trial methodologies and different ways of collecting data and building the evidence base. And we've had a lot of pushback from sort of self-appointed groups of doctors, who are themselves funded by pharmaceutical businesses. So look, whether it's explicit corruption, and whether people are really thinking, I want to stop this medicine coming to market, I don't know. But money does change how you think.
Sure, and that's what I wonder. I wonder, do people sit in a room? Is there a board meeting? Is there execs? And they're like, well, this cannabis industry is going to be a threat to our stock price. We need to lobby against this. And is it like a legitimate meeting whereby they've got evidence, or is it they're fearful and they're attacking it? Because in the end, it's kind of fucking evil.
It is kind of evil. I guess, look, money talks, people are trying to protect their livelihoods, their profit streams,
profit streams against the health of kids.
Yeah. This is where it gets interesting. This is where, Bitcoin actually becomes a really interesting proposition for alternative medicines or, medicines that are currently prohibited.
Well, that was the point I was making with my mum. So it's funny, when I was chatting to my dad about it, I mean, my dad hasn't taken any drug. Well, and that's not true now. No, that's not true. I'll come to that.
Sounds like a good story.
No, my dad was like zero interest in any drugs. For him, he's like Zamo. Marijuana is you're in a ditch. And that's fine. That's cool. Yeah. But when mum got sick, I showed him the research on cannabis oil, and he was like, oh, okay, but how do we get it? I was like, well, there's these websites where you have to use this thing called Bitcoin, and I wasn't in Bitcoin at the time, so we went and got some Bitcoin, and then we went on. It wasn't Silk Road because it had been closed down. I think it was Sheep Marketplace, whatever it was. We got it. Fortunately, it was too late. Mum died, but it had maybe a therapeutic effect for her. But either way, we did it. But I had to get, because it's that point where I think that was my point where I suddenly, like, it was the first peel of the layer of the onion where I was like, oh, fuck government. Because I'm like, you have these laws whereby they are preventing my mum getting access to a treatment she wants, where it's her choice, she's dying, and because you've got these archaic laws, I can't do it. Well, fuck you, I'm going to do it anyway. And that was when I was like, okay, I now get Bitcoin, and I now get why this is important. Interestingly enough, when after Mum died, God, my dad might be upset with me saying this, but he was struggling to sleep. He's in grief, and I got him a weed vape, and he started to go to bed. Just have a little toot before bed, and he said he could sleep. And absolutely. He doesn't do it anymore because he can sleep okay now. But it clicked his brain that this has a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, testimony is everything in this. It is literally what is the individual testimony, and once you start to hear testimony piled upon testimony, I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but it starts to mount up. And this is the argument that I've been making with the regulators, that if we can do studies over not 100 people, but 100,000 people, and we can show that there's some benefit from these drugs, then we can start to build the evidence base in a very different way to the traditional, big pharma-driven route of very expensive trials, very long-winded recruitment. It takes years to produce the results, So I think there is that we're on the cusp of a transformation in how we think about healthcare in general. And I think one of the outcomes of COVID and lockdown is that we're all much more interested in what we're doing to our bodies, and who's telling us what we do to our bodies.
Yeah, the COVID one's interesting. I remember going to see my doctor about it. Not so much for myself, because I'm like, whatever, I'll have it. I'm not worried about it.
Yeah.
I had no fear, but it was more my kids.
Yeah.
And my doctor said I would not give this to my children.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. So this is getting pushed everywhere. But a doctor, who's trained for years is telling me, do not give this to your children. Make sure they don't have it. And then didn't go through it.
I had a former editor of the British Medical Journal tell me that, there probably is a benefit for older populations, but much
probably
below
or possibly.
I guess at that time we didn't really know.
No.
But he was saying, look, for everyone below the age of 50, it's marginal if there's a benefit at all. But because of the public health agenda we had to take, we had to push the message.
Yeah. So the block you've got the pharmaceutical.
So there's this element of kind of lobbying
Yeah.
and how we bring drugs to market and how doctors are educated, and we don't actually teach about the endocannabinoid system in medical schools.
Okay. At all.
Very limited. Yeah. If you were to ask the average doctor, what is the endocannabinoid system, I think a lot of them would struggle with it.
Is that is there like conspiracy behind that? Don't teach this because of, or is it just because it's not developed and understood because of the fact we haven't had the scientific research?
I mean, look, it's another facet of how we do healthcare. It takes decades for discoveries to become accepted and then permeate the textbooks and then get passed down to the students. So often what you learn as a student, by the time you start to practice, is out of date. And it becomes very difficult, to stay up to date as a doctor.
It's funny, these things, you go down one of these rabbit holes and you start to question everything. Did you do economics at school?
No.
I did economics. Me and Gav went to school, people won't know this, but I did economics at A-level, and we were taught this thing called Keynesian economics. And so as I just took it as given. This is the economic model that we use, and it works. And this is fact, not a theory that has opposing voices.
Yeah.
And I was just taught that. It was only when we got into Bitcoin and studying money, I realized Keynesian economics is complete bullshit. Keynesian economics, I don't know if you know this, but basically this theory that you can how would you explain it? You can continue to increase the money supply as long as you keep inflation under control. But it's really what it is. It's a economic system that allows the government to create more money to inflate away their own debt. It's complete propaganda bullshit. And there's an alternative theory of economics called Austrian economics, which and look, I won't get into the details now. That's for another show. But the point being is that I look back at school and think, why weren't both of these taught and debated? Why didn't we as kids? I mean, we learn one from debating, but we're exposed to two different economic schools of thought. But no, we're only exposed to the one, which is the one which suits government's money printing press.
Yeah. And look, I guess the sort of equivalent here is the role of plant-based medicines in healthcare. And I guess, we have this sort of Western pharmaceuticalized model of healthcare and of bringing drugs to market. But in other parts of the world, it's very different. Cannabis is one of the fundamental ingredients in traditional Chinese medicine, called ma. In Ayurvedic medicine, ganja. And India and China have developed different ways of doing healthcare, based on far more based on natural products, plants, and fungi, mushrooms in the case of the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. And unfortunately, those systems of medicine historically, I think they've been sort of mocked in the West, laughed at, denigrated. But I think, there's this sort of merging now of, the Western sort of analytical approach, heavy data collection and rigor with this approach from the East, which is, not about single medicines or single molecules, but concoctions of plants and, mixtures. And I think that bringing the two together is actually where healthcare will be heading. And that's definitely the approach that I've been taking in my work.
Do you know that Chinese medicine shop in Bedford? The arcade. You walk down the arcade toward Pigeon Square. You've got that next bit.
Okay.
There's like that old Chinese medicine place. Do you know it?
I'm not familiar. No.
So it's been there for years. Anyway, I mean, I Chinese medicine to me was just like some wacko thing.
Stuff, right?
Yeah, it's kind of thing. When my mum was sick with cancer, she'll go and try that because she'll try anything.
Yeah.
I get eczema sometimes, and I had one day where my whole face came up red, like really like all across it. I looked terrible. And somebody said, I'll go to the Chinese place to get acupuncture. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Anyway, I went down there. Within an hour, it had gone. I had acupuncture on my back and literally it all gone off my face.
Yeah.
I was like, what the fuck?
I mean, there are concepts in these Eastern systems of medicine which I just don't think appear in the West. So I don't think, take breathing, for example, right? Yoga has something to say about breathing. The Chinese have a system, around movement and breathing. I don't know what the West has to say. I don't know what Western medicine would say about breathing and the role of breath. What role does breath work play in your body, in your physiology, in your mind? Diet plays a much, much bigger role in Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine as a preventative medicine. How do you stop yourself getting ill? And again, we don't have too much of that type of thinking here in the West.
But that's not. I think that's changing.
It is definitely changing.
There's a private doctors on the Bedford High Street called the Medic Centre. Okay. And so I signed up there because I signed up for an appointment at Pemberley Surgery where I've got, that's the doctors I have. And it was a 3-week wait for an appointment. I was like, what the fuck? The Medic Centre is a private one on the High Street. And it's £50 for an appointment. So you can either wait 3 weeks or pay £50. Usually they'll see you that day. Sometimes it's the next day. And it's really interesting because they start to get to know you. And as part of that, I was going because I have this heart condition called SVT, where my heart rate just goes bananas sometimes. Okay. And so I went in to see them. I've had all the tests, but we have they get to know me. We're always talking about preventative things, diet. Yeah. They also do vitamin injections, vitamin infusions, which I've had, which are weird, by the way. Weird taste you get. But it's a whole different approach. Yeah. Like I found with going to the GP, it was appointment.
Yeah.
Actually, I can go back a step. I mean, you know, my drug background, when I was coming off coke, I wasn't in a good way, and I was quite like depressed. And when I went to the doctor, they prescribed me antidepressants, and I didn't want to take them. I was like, fuck this. And so I sat in my car. I've told about this on the podcast before, but I looked up the alternatives, and it was like running, meditation, and yoga. Yeah. And I wasn't. I'd taken a year off work, so I bought some trainers that day. I went out running. I ran nearly every day for a year, pretty much, and I was doing dance a lot thinner then as well. When I had an anxiety attack, I would meditate, and I was probably doing yoga 3 times a week. And it took about 2 months to like really see a massive impact. Within a year, it all gone. Yeah. But if I'd gone on antidepressants, I could still be taking them today.
Yeah. Look, we have unfortunately a medical system that, in general, is quite happy to prescribe. You know, it's almost like the first course of action is a drug, and the last resort is a lifestyle change. And somehow we need to flip that. And we need to flip it from really, really early on in a person's life.
Why is that though? Like, are our doctors incentivized the same way as doctors in the US are? Do they make money off writing out a prescription?
No, it's very different here. But I guess, look, sociologically, when was the NHS, you know, formed? It was, you know, in the 40s, and it was to deal with acute conditions, right? It was if you're fucked, you know, you go to the hospital. You know, if there's an issue, you go to the hospital. It wasn't ever designed to deal with chronic conditions. And our food system, over time, has built up a set of conditions around basically, you know, metabolic conditions, diabetes, and our lifestyle have led to, you know, increased incidence of cancer. So we have these 2 kind of big blocks that we need to figure out how we deal with. And I just don't think it's drugs. I think it's not suffering from them in the first place is the best way to deal with it. So what are those preventative measures that we need to put in place? And who's thinking about them and how they're going to get financed and funded? And, you know, unfortunately, once someone's sick, there's a whole infrastructure around what do we do to give them drugs. If someone's healthy, there isn't that same infrastructure around how do we keep them healthy. Yeah. And that's what we need to build. And that's why I think, again, alternative money or new rails to build that healthy infrastructure is really interesting. The whole longevity movement is super interesting, right? So, you know, most of us are healthy and we want to live for longer. But who is doing the research? Who is paying to do that research? Because, you know, aging right now is not considered a disease. And pharma companies treat diseases. So we have to figure out how do we allocate money to these other areas which are not considered as a disease.
It's almost like we should start earlier. I mean, personally, if I could, I would take my daughter out of school now because it's become almost pointless. I see her come back with her homework and I see what she's doing. I'm like, this is fucking ridiculous. I'm helping her with her homework. There's no critical thinking really. It is still memorizing facts. Mm-hmm. It is still writing out pages of statements based on facts. And there's they want to teach sex education, right? And they want to teach safety with sex, but they don't want to teach money. They don't want to teach them how to understand the difference between assets and money and wealth creation. They don't teach them about food and nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely.
All these things you're thinking, well, hold on a second.
How are you tuning our kids up for their future lives? You know,
you know, like what's the prep we're doing here? And so I just feel like that. And it's funny. I don't know about you, but you go down one rabbit hole. You know, whether it's Bitcoin, you get to food, you get to health, you get to pharma. But I feel like there's a large part of society hasn't woken up to this. And when you try and explain it, you sound like a fucking psycho. You're like, Pete's that weirdo. Yeah, he's into like Bitcoin and like weird shit.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, you know my brother, right? My brother works. You interviewed my brother.
I did. Yeah.
So my brother works in the NHS and is very much part of the established healthcare system.
What does he think of this?
I guess he works on the coalface, right? He sees patients in A&E, and and now he's pretty senior in the NHS. And we've had our conversations. I think he's now starting to see that there are other models. You know?
Okay.
Yeah, I remember him calling me up to ask about administering CBD to a patient because he didn't have any guidelines himself 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. So look, there is this other world that needs to be, as you say, you sound like a kind of
Crazy.
You sound like a crazy, right?
Crazy
But once it's built and you show people, then they realize themselves.
But isn't it weird? Because the crazy thing is the natural plant. The non-crazy thing is the big pharma developed product.
Yeah, exactly.
Mass marketed to people.
Yeah, that's the power of conditioning, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the power of your frame of reference. And, it takes a lot to kind of, even realize that this is the frame of reference, let alone think that there's another alternative view.
But I find with government as a whole, I've swung between being very progressive minded to conservative minded and think, well, who should I vote for? I should vote for this. I don't vote at all. I haven't voted in the last 3 elections because I realize they're all lying fuckers. But that takes a long time to get to that point where when you start to see behind the veil, and you can get that as well when I start talking, trying to explain to somebody why I don't vote. Now, you must vote. No, this is why I don't vote, because nothing changes. Everything just gets progressively worse.
Yeah.
And trying to get people to understand that's really difficult.
But I think, look, systemic change, which I think is what you're talking about, I think starts with money, like a systemic change in money. Because I think once you do that, look, I mean,
that's what Tommy Frisbee said the other day.
I mean,
he said to us, because we were talking about the problem with politics. He said a lot of people have voted for Labour because they were so fed up with the Conservative Party. But what they've now introduced another party, which isn't trying to change the economics of the country by spending less, it's by taxing more. The answer is always tax more. Yeah. I was when I came into London today, I was showing Anna as we entered the congestion zone. I said this was designed to stop people coming into London. It really is just a new taxation system. The National Lottery is a taxation system. They just tax everything they can, and trying to get people to unwind from that. Saying look, there are alternatives here.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, it requires different money, I think, is the key point. One of the interesting things that I've, I guess, learned about over the last kind of couple of years, I think, is the clash at the intersection of Bitcoin and science. I think there's some really interesting things that are going to happen. Yeah. Because once you can start to build these alternative funding models, then I think you can start to see science done in a different way. Everything from how we design studies, to recruiting for studies, to conducting studies, to publishing and disseminating the research and sharing the data openly. What would the Bitcoin standard look like if it was applied to, the scientific process?
It's like what Eric Weinstein was saying to us.
Yeah. And do you want to remind him?
So he was basically saying Bitcoiners are getting fabulously wealthy, and what are you doing with it? And these are areas where you can make meaningful change.
Yeah, exactly.
The interesting thing about Bitcoiners as well is that a lot of them, when they start to invest their Bitcoin wealth, it's not about return. So they go through these periods of massive wealth growth. If Bitcoin does a 10x, most investments don't do a 10x in a
lifetime.
Let alone a 3-month period. And then it happens to them every 4 years. And so suddenly when you start to invest, like I do it, I essentially just give money away because there are people who are trying to do things within the Bitcoin industry like this is useful. That technology that you're building there is useful for privacy. Yeah. Or that study you're doing is useful. Yeah. Here's some Bitcoin. Yeah. And so there's a lot of philanthropy in Bitcoin. Yeah. What was the name of it? He called it, Daniel Kraus called it.
Oh.
Yeah.
What, a term for the philanthropy association?
Yeah, but it was like an investment version of philanthropy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I can't.
Like you're not going to make money, but you're doing it anyway. Danny will find it, but there's a lot of philanthropy. So I think the Bitcoin standard version of this is possibly considerations for. I think you have to get into possibly a new jurisdiction to prove yourself, because I'm pretty sure, I don't know what the regulatory process is for trials and approvals. And I can understand why they're complicated for chemical compounds where the wrong chemical compound can kill you. Yeah. But when it's a plant.
Exactly. So the safety profile is basically established and it's all about how we find what's effective.
Yeah.
And we can do that much more quickly, for sure.
And so what kind of solid milestones have you reached with that?
In terms of proving this plant's effective?
that have been widely accepted?
I mean, as I said, the most widely accepted is a drug called Epidiolex, which is for kids with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. So, the rare pediatric epilepsy conditions. And that drug has been approved by the FDA in America and the EMA in Europe and the MHRA, and it's widely prescribed. It's a blockbuster now. It's going to be doing $1 billion in revenue.
Wow. How's that administered?
Drops.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, that is probably the most widely accepted, that is the gold standard, it's been approved by the medical regulators. Beyond that, we've got, as I say, these sort of markets that are emerging, which it's not anecdotal evidence, but it's not quite the gold standard, but there are like large cohort studies where we've got lots of data. We've run these what are called registries in Europe, right? So each country, when they say, okay, I'm going to introduce cannabis, they say we're going to collect data in some format. So we have registries of, let's say, 5,000 to 10,000 people that show quality of life improves, pain scores decrease, mental health scores improve, So those sorts of studies are starting to get us to a place where regulators will say, okay, we don't have the gold standard, but we have enough to make us comfortable that we can introduce these as a medicine.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. What does the Bitcoin standard of this industry look like? I think what the Bitcoin standard did, and it's not a perfect book, but what it did was it made you understand how money should work in an uncorrupted, organic environment. Because essentially Bitcoin is just digital gold. So what are the properties of gold that Bitcoin offers, and how does that stop man corrupting it? Because most of these are from the corruption of man.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it's not so much, it's the health industry as a whole, holistically, the Bitcoin standard, and probably, he did the fiat,
The fiat standard.
Yeah, but he's also done the food
Fiat
one,
food,
hasn't he?
yeah.
Yeah, he's done
really?
something called fiat food.
Okay, interesting.
So probably the next one is he'll probably do fiat health.
Yeah.
And talk about how fiat money and because the mass availability of money at low interest rates, zero interest rates, has allowed people to invest. It's skewed. How does Alan Farrington say it?
Say what?
The fiat money, when you've got zero interest rates, the way it corrupts capitalism. He's got a term for it. I can't remember what it was.
I'm not sure the term you mean.
It's a misallocation of resources.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
In that world of 0%, you
And
fund all sorts of crap.
And so, what is that version in the in the health industry? That combination of stock price,
I think
the need to grow,
Yeah.
lobbying, corruption. What has that done to the health industry? And I always feel like it's super evident when you go to the US because they allow for advertising of
exactly.
pharmaceutical products, and you go and they stick on the TV. Every third thing is an advert
For some drug.
Yeah, for a condition I don't even know exists. I've never even heard of, with this huge warning at the end.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
It's basically the need for low time preference healthcaphealthcare, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
that's it.
Yeah.
I'm sure
That Daniel Kravitz quote was, "Don't be a venture capitalist, be a speculative philanthropist."
Speculative philanthropist. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, as I say, I've got into the world of sort of decentralized science, which I think is fascinating. And the reason I got into this world of decentralized science was because I was looking for ways in which you could fund research into things like how does cannabis impact on kids with rare epilepsy conditions. It's not the sort of thing that a big pharma company is going to fund. It's just not a big enough market. And if you're not getting money from a government, or the NIHR, the National Institute of Healthcare Research, or who is going to fund this work? And my view was there's a community of really motivated parents and their families of these kids with epilepsy who will do the fundraising themselves. And historically, what they've done is crowdfunding, charitable. They'll go and do a marathon or a charity walk or whatever. And I was thinking, well, actually, that's one way of raising this money, but surely the better way to raise this money is to tokenize the research. If there's a way in which we can figure out how, if you do the research, you own the research, and you can monetize the research, and that is the way to decentralize how we do this research. And that's where it becomes powerful, because if we can all congregate together and raise the capital that we need to do a certain project in longevity, and we own the IP that we generate, that becomes something that we can, it's a new type of organization that can do research.
I think the problem is if you tokenize it, it's the incentives change. You'll suddenly have
That's been the challenge.
endless,
That has been the challenge.
endless tokens for endless pieces of research. When you make it more like this speculative philanthropy, it's people having a good argument. If there's no token or kind of capital return that you're overly thinking about, if it's just more like the speculative philanthropy, you're actually very well considered about where you'll put your money.
Yeah, and I think there are digital instruments that are emerging to allow for this to happen in the scientific research space.
Has there been a meeting of Bitcoin in this?
So there are a couple of companies that people can look at. One called Molecule, which is interesting. There are a few DAOs.
Why have I heard of those? God, I've definitely heard of those. Maybe you told me about it the other night.
Maybe I told you about it. Yeah. But there are a few DAOs that have emerged to focus on particular conditions. My favorite is Hair DAO. So there's a community of people who are trying treatments for hair loss.
Okay.
And they're sharing this, in a Discord server. There is a DAO focused on women's health called Athena DAO, which is also interesting. So women's health historically has been underfunded and marginalized, and I think if women can get together to fund this research and focus on the conditions that are important to them, like endometriosis and the menstrual cycle and menopause.
This is really interesting as well, because I think back to when my mum was diagnosed. So she was diagnosed, I think, stage 3C ovarian cancer. So she's quite late on, and she was quite militant in her research. She immediately got on the internet and it was just research after she read everything. And actually, do you know what? She survived something like nearly 3 years, and the doctors had given her about half that. She'd gone vegan, which is why I went vegan with her for a while. Yeah. She went vegan. She stopped drinking alcohol. She got in really great shape. But she was finding bits of research, reading them and trying things. There wasn't Discord at the time. There wasn't a community, but there's lots of people around the world probably doing the same research at the same time.
Yeah, it'd be amazing to plug them all in together.
Yeah.
Right. We will develop these platforms to connect these people, especially in these rare childhood conditions. Often the parents are the experts.
Right.
They're the ones who've done the research. They know more than the doctors. They've found the academic wherever they are in the world and talk to them, and they want to run some research. And we should empower them. They are actually extremely powerful actors in finding new drugs for their kids. But we don't have the infrastructure at the moment to enable this to happen. So I'd love to see the barriers to doing research dropping, the costs of doing research dropping, and also the infrastructure that we can put in place. AI is brilliant for this. It really is. It means that you can go from sort of being an amateur researcher to having the tools to put together the protocols and think about how you go and find the participants you need for your particular clinical trial and write up the results.
So it sounds like you really need large legislative change.
Yeah.
What is the key change that's required? Like, what would you like to see? Go, okay, we can move.
Personally, on the cannabis side, I would like to see like a number of different steps. I think the first is decriminalisation. It is mind blowing to me that young, 15-year-old black kids in Hackney are getting criminal records on the basis of having, half a joint. At the event yesterday at Drumsheds, I spoke to one of the security guards who said a friend of his had to go back into prison for having half a joint on him.
What?
Wild.
Yeah, remedial sentence, right?
I bet there's some racism in there as well.
Yeah,
I know,
I
don't smoke weed anymore just because it mongs me out. But if I wanted to, I'd happily walk down the street with a joint. And I don't think if I got stopped by a policeman, I'd be arrested.
It wouldn't be an issue. There is a huge racial component. So I'd start with decriminalisation. In fact, there's a great organisation called Transform, and there's a chap there called Steve Rolls who's written a book around how you'd regulate. And in fact, there's a crowdfunder that they're doing. If any of your audience are Bitcoin billionaires and want to go and support, Steve's doing some really interesting work around how we'd regulate cannabis in the UK. My view is we sort of follow the German model. So decriminalisation first. It's crazy that this is happening, and then a sort of non-profit model of allowing people to grow plants at home and congregate into social clubs for collective growing. And I think that solves most of the problems. I tell you the one thing I hate, it's the smell of weed on the streets.
New York, man. Have you been to New York?
Finsbury Park, dude. I mean, down the road from me, it stinks.
You can't go anywhere in New York and not smell weed.
It smells better than New York used to.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Weed over rat piss.
Yeah, exactly. But I've heard in New York it's all pervasive. It's everywhere.
You get on.
It's like
You get into New York. You just get off out your Uber, and it's like
And it's
what?
just everywhere,
It's
yeah.
like the whole of Manhattan.
Yeah, it's because they don't have consumption lounges. They don't have places where people can go and consume this. And actually,
I was going to say, carry on.
well, look, the consumption lounge is actually really interesting, right? So again, going back to the work at Diageo, the alcohol industry has a phrase, brands are built in the on-trade. So the alcohol world, you can split into the on-trade, which is a bar, a pub, a restaurant, and the off-trade, which is, a supermarket and off-license. And the brand is built in the bar, right? The brand is built around the consumption experience, which is why folks like Diageo go and train bartenders to recommend you a particular drink and make it in a certain way. And, you develop this association with a alcoholic brand through consuming it in a bar. And then you go and buy it from, the supermarket. And that space doesn't exist in cannabis. The consumption lounge space for people to build brands doesn't exist. And so you get, the negative outcome of people smoking weed on the streets in New York or wherever.
The decriminalisation step in the UK, how far are we off that? Is it being debated?
It's not been debated. I mean, I was sort of, what can I say, optimistic in that David Lammy, I think, is pretty senior now in the Home Office. I think Yvonne Cooper is Home Secretary, and maybe he's one below her. But David Lammy is obviously a black guy. He has studied at Harvard. He has seen the impact of racism on and prohibition on black people in the US. And I thought he'd actually be, and I think he's talked about this, he'd actually be a good person to spearhead the decriminalisation effort in the UK with its focus on racial justice. That doesn't feel like a crazy step to take. And no matter how militant Keir Starmer wants to be on, not appearing to be soft on drugs, I think that's like a sensible first step. Much beyond that, I think we've got a long way to go. I don't really see any change in the first term of a Labour government, but if they get to a second term and they want to make something happen, they'd probably have the mandate. And
what's the legal position with medical use in the UK at the moment? Say if I have anxiety and cannabis, I can use cannabis to treat it, and it's a version with a decent amount of THC.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is this. So as of 2018, cannabis has an acknowledged medical use. And the pathway to get access to cannabis is via a private clinic. And to get to that private clinic, you're typically referred by your GP.
Okay.
So you've got anxiety. Normally, they ask you to try a couple of the pharmaceuticals just to make sure that they don't work. And then you can say, look, I've tried them and they have horrible side effects or they don't work for me. I'd like to try cannabis as a medicine. And they'll then say, okay, you can go to try one of these. I think there are maybe 30 clinics now in the UK.
Okay. And how do you have to consume it on site or can you
No,
take it?
No. You get it. It's mail order. It gets delivered to your home. Yeah.
And do you have a choice? Can you have it as a gummy, a drink, or
So, great question. So in terms of the products that are legally available in the UK right now, there is the flower, and that you have to vaporize. You have to heat it. You can't combust your cannabis flower. So you get a device or a machine of some sort, and you can heat up the cannabis. There are oils which are available.
Hold on. But can I put it in a Rizzler and smoke it?
Not legally.
So you can't do it. So it has to be a specific device.
Yeah, it has to be vaporized
But if you're just getting it delivered to your house,
no one's going to know, right?
But if it's like you can buy a vape type device, or is it like a pipe or?
Yeah, it's like a like I guess a sort of mobile oven, like a transportable oven that you can grind up cannabis and put it in, and it'll heat it, and the vapors will release the THC at 185 degrees or whatever it is.
What is the difference between putting it in a Rizzler and smoking it?
Well, a Rizzler burns at 800 degrees, and it harms your lungs, and it incinerates a lot of the plant material and doesn't give you the full therapeutic benefit. So it's wasteful.
I mean on the legal side.
Oh, on the legal side, it is. So look, it is illegal. It's a misuse of a prescription drug.
To put it in a Rizzler.
Yeah.
But logically, is there any difference? Do you think that is a legal position that's been taken?
It's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy because if someone wants to smoke a drug because it works for them, then they should have the right to do that.
So say me and Danny are in Finsbury Park. I've got my vaporizer.
Yeah.
And he's got his Rizzler.
Yeah.
And we're seeing smoke and the police come along.
Yeah.
Can they arrest Danny for having the Rizzler?
Yeah.
But would they have to leave me alone?
Yeah.
How do I prove? Is there?
That's a great question. So,
Yeah.
Because it's confusing, right? You
Yeah.
can't tell the difference between cannabis that's been prescribed by a doctor and is like legally delivered to your home, and cannabis which has been grown in a tent in a flat in North London. So, according to the law, if a policeman approaches you and you have the cannabis medicine in its original packaging with the label attached to the original packaging, and you have some form of proof of ID, then you can say you're a legally prescribed patient.
And they cannot arrest you.
Correct.
So I'm going somewhere with this.
Yeah.
Say I wanted to have a support group for people who have got medical conditions that require them to use this approved version of cannabis in a vaporizer, and I want to run that support group in my bar on a Wednesday night.
This is happening, Pete.
So it's happening.
So this is the model that actually we should talk about, because this is how cannabis consumption can hit the UK high street.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see these models emerge where, a premises will accept people who have a cannabis prescription to come on site and vape their cannabis prescription legally. So that is the mechanism by which we can sort of start to scale this in the UK. Yeah, absolutely.
So and it's a bit like, I think about when I'd go to California and I'd be going Venice Beach. I said to you the other day, and there'll be the Dr. Green Thumbs people walking up and down with a clipboard.
Yeah.
And if you come and say, I've got anxiety, you fill in a form, they can sell you weed.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, look, there will be people with anxiety doing it, but there's some people who will be using it as a loophole to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we all know there shouldn't be any block.
No.
So let's,
But this is the way in which, so as I mentioned, the Germans have moved to an adult use framework, right? Recreational cannabis, grow 3 plants at home, have these social clubs. When you ask the Germans what was the tipping point on this journey from drug to medicine to lifestyle, they said once you had 100,000 patients in Germany, the media narrative changed.
And do you know what we have in the UK?
We have about 45, 50,000 in the UK.
And have there been any attempts to police go to these social clubs and try and close them down? They find out everyone has got legal approval.
In the UK?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are the legal clubs which operate as licensed businesses. I mean, if the police come, then welcome them in. We'll show you all the paperwork and we'll show you the prescriptions. And this idea of legal defensibility is brilliant, right? It means you can operate in the open. These businesses exist. Where it gets really interesting is we're now using this nascent medical model in the UK almost as a backdoor for recreational.
That's exactly where I'm going with. Because what I'm thinking is,
we're forcing it open.
When can you get to the point they can come to my bar, fill in a form, and buy
it, right? So that is the experience to deliver, right? So can you go to your bar, have a telehealth consultation over an iPad with a doctor who does the equivalent of your Venice Beach thing of giving you a card? You have that consultation, you get a digitally signed prescription sent to your app or your wallet on your phone. You then walk around to the local pharmacy, pick up your cannabis, and then come back into your bar and you can start to vape it. And that experience, I think we could deliver. And that would be transformative.
So it feels like it's these kind of like little baby steps one by one of pushing the law just to let people know the world is not going to collapse.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing bad is going to happen.
Yeah. We keep progress over perfection, right? Perfection is, cannabis is regulated like tomatoes and we can go and grow it at home, fields of it. But on the way, let's not let, let's not let this sort of incremental progress prevent us from understanding what the end goal is. We can make these steps with a view to actually where we want to end up. Yeah,
because you want to get to that normalization point because like brand-wise, for example, I went to your event, it looked like a bunch of weed smokers there. It looked like the people I look when you and I first spoke to us all those years ago. But it just, everyone kind of looks the same. Yeah. But it's like you say in the US, it's not like that.
No, it's not.
It's people looking like they do when they come to a bar on a Saturday night because it's so normalized.
Yeah, exactly.
And in some ways, as a bar owner, I'd rather people getting high than drinking because
there's a hilarious story from the Euros this summer where the German police were asking English football fans to smoke weed, not drink beer.
I understand why.
Yeah. No one's going to be like, wrecking a town square if they're.
I don't think I need 5 bouncers on Saturday night if everyone's high.
Yeah, exactly. The security at our event on Saturday said they haven't had as pleasant a time before at any event. It's a very mellow crowd.
You have. I've been conscious that you keep mentioning adult use, and we should be aware of that. Like, this is not a zero risk product.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there are risks. Yeah, I think the risks are much more around the developing brain than adults. So I think, look, above the age of sort of 25, cannabis is actually a longevity tool. So I think the risks are for the developing brain, between the age of sort of 13 and 20, let's say, and in particular with high THC, high potency products. And look, one of my concerns about the way that cannabis is being legalized in the US is that you run the risk of quite young people having access to quite potent products without any safeguards around them.
Is there like a competitive race to produce the most high,
the strongest?
Yeah, does that exist?
It does. But again, it comes with education. So right now, it's sort of bang for your buck. And most consumers are buying on the basis of how much THC can I get per dollar that I spend to get as high as I possibly can. And I guess to draw an analogy with wine, for example, it's like saying I want to drink the wine with the highest alcohol percentage. Whereas you and I know that a wine with a low alcohol percentage, but the aroma and the body and all the characteristics of the wine, that is what you're really looking for. And so as this market gets more sophisticated, it won't be people looking for 25, 30% THC. It'll be people looking for 10% THC. They don't want to get completely blitzed, but there are other components of the experience that they're looking for.
Well, I feel like skunk turned a lot of people off weed, because I remember the skunk era. That was when I went to uni, when it was everywhere. When I remember at school, it was resin and it was weed, normal weeds. Yeah. You always have those seeds in. Yeah. And then when I went to uni, like, skunk was a rare thing. It was like a treat. And then it was everywhere at uni, and you were just so fucked all the time. Yeah. So monged. Yeah. I couldn't smoke anymore.
Yeah. Look, I mean, okay, so skunk is a catch-all term for high-strength THC cannabis, right? That's how we describe it. Yeah, look, I have sort of varying thoughts on this. I always hear, in my day, 20 years ago, this was much weaker, right? But I feel like I've heard that for 50 years.
It just means it's getting stronger. Your tolerance is growing.
Yeah, exactly. But, you heard people in the 90s say in the 70s it was, not the stuff that you get now. And you hear people now going, in the 90s it wasn't quite the stuff that you get now. So I don't quite buy this idea that there's this ever-increasing potency of cannabis. If you go back thousands of years, actually, when I mentioned, cannabis is, weed is like grapes, hash is like wine. These derived products, these extracted products that you make, that you've seen in India over the last 5,000 years, where they literally just rub the plant together and make something, that's potent, When I think about the Afghan farmers markets, that have existed for hundreds of years, that's potent stuff that they've got in there.
I was talking more like prevalence.
Meaning,
it became...
Can you get access to it, you mean?
Like I say, when I go back to the point, the dealer only had one type of drug. It just always became skunk. There was no alternative because there's no open market. And
but again, it comes to bang for, bang for your buck, right? If you're spending, £25, what do you want to... I want to get the strongest stuff, It will last me the longest.
Yeah, I mean, everything points in the direction that, like, something has to change, and there are just so many benefits. Actually, sorry, let me just go back a step. You talk about under 25. So it'd be interesting how they regulate it then, because, at the moment, you've got to be 18 to drink, US 21. What's the age restriction in the US with cannabis?
21.
21. So they've matched it. So if there's like a 7-year gap from 18 to 25, do you think we would end up matching the alcohol market, or do you think it should have a different... Or do you?
I think it comes down to education and personal choice. So I've had a conversation with my 13-year-old son to say, look, I think you should stay off any psychoactive substance until you're, able to understand what it does to you. Yeah, exactly, right. I definitely don't want my son having the same experience that you and I had with
No.
cannabis as, 14, 15-year-olds. But I think young people today are also, they're more aware of it, My 10-year-old knows what it's all about, They see it around town.
Yeah, I also saying that. I mean, my son and his group of friends are certainly the ones that were like us, who would have been easily exposed to it. There hasn't been a big weed culture.
It's
in
really
their
interesting.
groups.
Teen marijuana use is down in the US on the back of legalization. And I
not
think
cool.
it's not cool, right? If granny and granddad are using it, then why would I want to,
Yeah, I mean, I know Connor smoked it, but not a lot. And
Yeah.
a couple of his friends, we have quite an open conversation about this. And I
Yeah.
know some of his friends have, but there's not,
Yeah.
like we were doing it every Saturday.
Yeah.
We were trying to get weed every Saturday. And when I went to uni, it was like
Yeah.
everyone was smoking weed all the time.
Yeah.
He said that's not really a thing.
Yeah.
There is, the big drug has actually been ketamine,
Yeah.
strangely.
Yeah. I've heard there's a sort of, widespread use of ketamine in university campuses, especially here.
What about other drugs? What about mushrooms? What
Yeah.
about MDMA? Where are we at with those? Because I'm fascinated by both.
Yeah. Look, it's interesting because when I was in Vegas, we spent a lot of time with the Burning Man crew because it's Vegas, right? And so we often thought that it'd be cannabis first, and then we'd move to the other drugs. Let's start breaking the stigma with cannabis, and then we can move on to all of the other psychedelics. And so I guess there are definitely studies happening in psilocybin, so magic mushrooms.
Yep.
For depression and PTSD and a variety of mental health conditions. There's research for MDMA, especially around couples therapy and alcoholism, showing promise. There are other compounds like DMT and ibogaine and, also being used in clinical trials. Ketamine is used actually at the moment in clinics in the UK for folks suffering from things like suicidal ideation and depression. So yeah, again, it feels like there's just a lot of research that needs to be done. They're quite challenging compounds to do research into. They challenge the sort of scientific norm, if you like. It's quite difficult to talk about, especially for things like mushrooms. What does it mean to have a spiritual experience? We don't often have the language in science to kind of describe how meaningful these experiences can be, especially in cases like terminal cancer. But it's interesting. It's interesting, for sure. New set of therapies. We had this psychedelics boom in the stock market a couple of years ago. That definitely has punctured over the last couple of years. But, those who are just diligently doing the work are going to wait for the next upturn in the market. And, as we bring data to regulators to show that these drugs work, you'll start to see them prescribed more widely. The US is again taking the lead on legalization efforts here. Places like Colorado and Oregon have introduced frameworks for magic mushrooms. Ketamine is available quite widely in the US online. And there's been a bit of a backlash on the back of, who's the guy from Friends who passed away? Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry, yeah.
Perry.
But that was the first time I'd ever heard of ketamine associated with the death.
Yeah, exactly. And it's somewhat demonized, ketamine. Again, we're talking about sort of media narratives when it comes to these drugs,
Horse tranquilizer.
Yeah.
Or elephants.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, ketamine, I think, is, as you say, it's definitely, it's not a psychedelic in the traditional sense. I believe it's called a cognitive disassociative. But, very popular.
When you draw a long enough, say, timeline out, we have a timeline here for marijuana where, I fully expect at some point we will hit that decriminalisation, because I don't see any markets reversing their decisions. And so, but there's an increasing number of markets where it's proven to, be safe, and it's proven to bring in good revenue for government. By the way, that's always a good driver.
Yeah.
And so we go through decriminalisation, and then social occasions, and then recreational, and eventually it just gets normalised. Could you see the same happening I can see the same with, say, mushrooms, but say something like MDMA, which feels more like a chemical. It feels more like a party drug.
Yeah.
Could you even see a stage where we get to recreational use of MDMA and kind of no one giving a shit?
Yeah, I can definitely see that being the case. I mean, what in a way, does it matter that it's not derived from a plant? It's about the dose and the route of administration and the effect and the side effects, and those are the important things. So yeah, I could absolutely see MDMA being used as a recreational psychoactive. I mean, it seems crazy, but why wouldn't you consider it like a coffee or tea or cannabis or any other substance in the future?
Yeah, and again, once you get past that, that legal block, you can then get the research and the products. Like I think of MDMA as something you bomb in water and you go dancing or hang out with your girlfriend. But would there be a drink whereby there's a mild effect, but it's instead of an antidepressant, you're having that drink?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, could it be available over the counter at low dose because it's safe and effective? And I mean, I think the biggest opportunity for cannabis products actually is in the sort of 2 to 4% range for THC. So very, very low levels of psychoactivity, which means that they can be sold over the counter. And you can imagine these products being sold in India and China by the boatload,
Is there ever a line for you? Because I think there's certain, I would think, would you really want to do this with cocaine? I mean, does cocaine have any medical?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
prescribed.
I know
pain relief,
benzos.
coca.
Yeah, but when you get to recreational, there are some significant potential harm. But then you say, well, people should be able to make their own choices. We should treat people like adults. And also by removing the prohibition, you're kind of cutting an arm off an industry which is run by gangs and people
absolutely.
of bad incentives. But do you ever get to a line and go, no, that fentanyl, no, we should stop there?
Look, fentanyl's challenging because it's a very kind of dangerous drug, in very small doses. So, look, there probably is a line, but do I think cocaine could be, could you go to Boots in the future and get cocaine? I don't see that being unimaginable.
And if everything was like regulated and clean cut, do people actually want fentanyl, or are they getting that because it's the readily available drug on the street, and really do they want heroin? Or
because at the moment they're getting it when they don't want it. I mean, I remember I always think of that. I mean, and I know there's a lot of the cases now in the USA where people have bought cocaine and they've died because there's been fentanyl in it. I always think specifically there was 4 comedians partying and had some coke, and 3 died, and 1, she survived and ended up in hospital. And you're thinking, well, look, they were demonized in certain ways, or they were shamed. I think it was more like public shaming.
Yeah.
There's a lot of public shame for her.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
really, they're in a private environment having a bit of fun. Yet 3 people have died because of prohibition.
Yeah, exactly.
Would those people be alive now?
Yeah.
They did a lot of this with Ross Ulbricht. When Ross Ulbricht was sentenced, he got a double life sentence for 40 years as a drug kingpin for the Silk Road. And they brought the families of, I think it was 6 people who'd bought drugs on the Silk Road, whose family members had died after buying drugs on it. And so they demonized the Silk Road and demonized Ross for that.
Yeah.
What they didn't do is bring up the research by the Drug Policy Alliance, which said they remove danger on the street. They remove the 2 points of violence, which is the trade itself, the meeting and doing the trade, and then the trade between gangs. It removed gangs.
Yeah, exactly.
It just became a professional business.
Yeah. No, someone asked me yesterday what happened to the drug trade once cannabis is legalized. And I mean, it's actually quite interesting because the illegal market is quite resilient. And the degree of resiliency actually depends on tax. If you tax your legal market so it becomes uncompetitive, people will just go to the illegal market.
Well, there's still an illegal market in California, right? There's illegal farms.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that because they've taxed it too high?
Yeah, because they've opted out of the existing framework for production and taxation. So, the requirements for producing the cannabis are burdensome. The taxes are onerous. Why bother? I'll just grow some plants here, and I've got my customers, and So again, it speaks to kind of government overbearing. If you go in, if you want to kind of disrupt this illegal market, then undercut it, and then over time you can start to take your tax revenue. But there is this dual economy that happens once you legalize drugs, and over time, though, the shift is towards the legal channel. Over time, once you iron out these issues, people would rather go to a legal store and have a nice experience than go to see their local dealer.
Yeah, and get it mail delivered or have the options in the trade.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so often when you look at these, I'm not a free market absolutist no government and no government at all, and I'm not anarcho-capitalist, but I as somebody who's created multiple businesses have just come up against so much bureaucracy and red tape and taxation, which stops the building of businesses and job creation. Yeah. And it's been a real eye opener for me. And we were talking about it the other day when we met at the pint, but I was just thinking that something has to change here. Mm-hmm. I think politics, it feels like the world has moved way beyond politics, and politics we feel like we're like 5 decades behind the world. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels sort of, in some ways, irrelevant to how people live their daily lives. And we've seen it in the sort of levels of disillusionment here.
Yeah, people are pissed off, man.
Yeah, but I feel like there's this sort of new politics, and we talked about this systemic change, and I don't know, are we reaching a tipping point where we see this, new money and new thinking align to allow us to see these sort of new systems of healthcare and media? It's going to be a very different way of organising what we do.
Well, if you ask us or other people, you got to fix the money first.
Yeah.
We say this.
I've faced into that. I've lived it actually, and I've seen it.
Yeah, fix the money, fix the world.
Precondition to exactly.
And it feels like so many parts of society are breaking. I think it's because of the money. I think the riots. I think the riots are from a combination of COVID lockdowns, political disillusionment, where you had. Boris's garden parties while everyone was locked down, a lot of people feeling they were lied to about the jabs, had their businesses foreclosed. Then we went through massive inflation where people feel poorer. I just think people are fed the fuck up, and it's all broken money. Yeah,
I think
broken money and broken politics.
Yeah, and I think understanding all that complexity is hard, and just blaming immigrants is easy.
Yeah, blaming immigrants. Exactly. Yeah, and it's the existing systems that are pushing that sort of narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
But and it's also that nod to like, I need a politician to solve this. Okay, that party says it's the immigrants' fault. Well, I've got someone to blame. I'm going to vote for them. Yeah. Or they're always giving us someone else to blame. That politics. It's this blame.
You interviewed Farage, didn't you? And he's a Bitcoin supporter, isn't he? I guess, does he want to fix the money?
Well, I think Bitcoin makes sense. Bitcoin makes sense to people who are conservative. Mm-hmm. So if you're conservative-minded, Bitcoin makes more sense because you have conservative economics. But classical liberals also get it, and some libertarians. I think it's a harder concept for people to get who may be from the more Labour socialist side, because their belief is that you should have a wider distribution of income. This kind of collectivist idea that you solve problems in society by making government bigger and taking money off people. You never do. You've got to have the biggest productive class possible. So he gets that. I've got like mixed feelings about Farage. I get why a lot of people dislike him, because he's a bullshitter like everyone else. I mean, I say that to his face. He is a bullshitter. He lied with the Brexit vote with the stats, but they all fucking lie. But there's two sides to him, which I experienced, which was really frustrating me. So I sat down with him before the interview, and I hung out with I hung out with Nigel. And then when I interviewed him, I interviewed Farage. It's like Eminem and Slim Shady. He goes into this character, and I was thinking, I wish you'd have been the person I just had a coffee with, because he was reasonable and rational. I disagree with immigrant blaming. Yeah. And that doesn't mean there isn't an issue with immigrants we should discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I disagree with the scapegoating. It is an issue, but it's not the primary issue.
Yeah.
It's, and I hate this, look over there, don't look here kind of thing we have with politics. But all politics has become about blame. Yeah. I'm just fucking sick of it. We've got a Labour Party now saying they've got to tax us because the Conservatives left a black hole. They would have taxed us anyway. It's all just blame. Yeah. There's no one in politics to look towards, though. They're all fucking dicks.
It requires new voices, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It requires new voices.
Yeah.
I guess,
We'll get there.
Yeah.
Is there anything we've not touched on you wish we had? I haven't asked you about yet. Covered a lot.
Wow. I don't think so. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Gav, I mean, I love that you're doing it. I feel the few conversations we've had over the last week or so, I feel a lot more aligned to what you're doing. And I feel like if we can help in any way, tell us.
Yeah, no, I'd love to find a way to harness, as you say, the Bitcoin community. I think there's a lot of like-minded people actually trying to achieve similar things.
Yeah, and I'm feeling kind of like politically active myself on here, doing it here, and just trying to get some logic out there and trying to get to people to think a bit more logically about these things. And so I'm going to be referencing this for a while, and you should just come back on and we'll talk about it again in the future. Do you want to send anyone anywhere? Would you follow you online? Or
I see.
Product
I mean,
Earth?
look, for sure. On Twitter, Gavinho, that's Gavin H-O. On similar on Insta, and then you can find Product Earth on Instagram, product_earth, and on Twitter as well, product_earth UK. But maybe I'll share some notes with you after this. And
keep fighting the good fight, Gav.
Thanks, man.
We're on your side.
Appreciate it.
I think we've, as a community, felt the same kind of pushback and bullshit. So we're on your side. Any way we can help, just give me a shout, man.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening, everybody. See you soon.